Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever Oceans Forest Streams video. My name is Griffin, and today we're going to start off this channel with making a simple single orchid display for a cloche. And this is just going to be an introduction into terrariums, so I thought let's start with a pretty simple, easy project to make, and we'll go from there. So I hope you enjoy. Of course, the materials we're going to need are a cloche. As you can notice from the beginning of the video, I decided to actually go with a larger cloche as the orchid I picked out fits better inside of it. The other things that we're going to need are a pot of some sort, or in my case, it's a ceramic bowl that I made for another project, but I decided I could use it. It is a little wobbly, so I decided to get a terracotta base for another planter and use that to stabilize the bowl. You're also going to want to get a piece of aquarium safe wood, and this is only to use it as support for the plant. I was also lucky enough to go and find some tropical-like moss that was grown inside of a greenhouse environment, so it should be great inside of the cloche for adding a little bit of color to the base and adding additional humidity. And of course, for the orchid cloche, we are gonna need an orchid. So I went with this Oncidium species. I'm not entirely sure exactly which one it is, but it should love the high humidity inside of a closed cloche. Here's some additional materials we'll need: silicone, orchid bark, sphagnum moss, perlite. This is fern leaves, a ruler, some PVC pieces, that's 1/2 inch, scissors, isopropyl alcohol to disinfect, and a drill with a 7/8 hole bit. A level, white spray paint, acrylic resin, and something to mix the resin with. When I started to plan this out, I was thinking that I was going to use that little piece of terracotta to secure to the bottom of this for stabilization, but then I decided I didn't like that too much. It was a little big, a little bulky. So I found a piece of glass that I had drilled previously from a larger aquarium that I decided to use for it, and I think this is going to work out a lot better. You want to make sure that when you're putting on something with silicone, it's nice to get a good seal around the entirety of whatever you're siliconing. This will help ensure that it's perfectly adhered. I'm just making sure that the bottom's level enough. Just visually, it's really not going to be structural. It's just to make sure that it doesn't look too lopsided. And I decided to do the same with the top, just to make sure that it is in fact actually level. The next thing we're going to do is drill a hole for the PVC pipe. Now, I also decided that I was going to put a humidifier in this to keep the humidity up. It's not necessary, but if you're interested in which humidifier I used, stay tuned for the next project where I will show exactly what I did. As you can see, I measured off from the area between the planter and the edge where the glass is going to meet on the base, and decided to drill right there. This wood actually, even though it's a relatively cheap base, was quite hard and required a little bit more effort than I wanted to put into drilling. You can see I split the bottom of it, but luckily it's going to get covered up with acrylic resin. This is me just measuring off to make sure that the pipe is going to leave me enough room to attach a T, and where I can set it inside just so it's hidden a little bit better. You can pretty much decide to use whatever color you'd like. I decided to go with a neutral white spray paint. This is just, personal preference. It's not going to really matter which spray paint you decide to use. It is going to get covered with acrylic resin, which should seal anything that might be bad for the plant. Also, look at the red dot at the top. That was from Sharpie. I can't believe that actually bled through. I mean, I couldn't cover that thing up. I tried. The next thing we're going to do is mix up the acrylic resin. I'm getting some water boiling. This is going to be a lot easier to work with. Warmer acrylic resin mixes a lot better than cold acrylic resin. Even though we do want hot water to warm up the acrylic, we don't want it boiling hot. So I'm cutting it with some hot water to bring that temperature down so it doesn't, melt the plastic or anything like that inside the container. When we're adding it to the container to hold the acrylic resin, you're really going to want to make sure that you get most of it inside the container. This pot that I'm using is terribly designed. It's spilling all over my stove. Also, don't be too judgmental about that stove. It's my studio stove. It's not one that I use for cooking. And we just got to get the cap off. That stinking little safety thing is like really locked in there. The cool thing about this particular acrylic resin, it is just a 1-to-1 ratio. I think most two-part resins are this way, but just in the off chance that you don't find one that's 1-to-1, I really recommend you actually get one that's 1-to-1. It makes mixing a lot easier. And it's not like it has to be 100% precise. I just kind of eyeballed it with the container that I was using and decided to just go with that. As you can see, the acrylic resin kind of gets a little bit opaque as you're mixing it. And don't worry, that's completely natural. You want to make sure that the chemical reaction is happening between the two of them. So just keep mixing and eventually it will clear itself back out. When applying the acrylic resin, it's good to make sure that you mix just enough that you're gonna use. You don't want to make too much, that's gonna obviously be a waste, but you don't want to make too little or you're not gonna get good coverage. So after it's mixed up, you apply most of it onto the container that you're, whatever the base is you're using. This one, like I said, this is just to seal the wood. It's going to be in a very humid environment. We don't want any mold to happen. That's the only reason why I'm using this acrylic resin. If you happen to find a cloche that has a glass base, that's perfect. As we design the layout, we want to make sure that, there's no dead material on the plant. That's going to just start molding inside of the closed system. So that's what I did right there. I just plucked that old bloom off. Right here, all I'm doing is leveling out the piece of wood. Even though it's going to act as a support, I want to make sure that it's not going to interfere with the glass once we put the cloche base, or I'm sorry, the cloche top on. That looks pretty good. So I'm just going to be backfilling it with that mixture I made of the 1 to 1 to 1 peat moss, orchid bark, and perlite. And I'm just going to be using this chopstick to get underneath the wood just to make sure that it's positioned relatively where I'd like it. It's always good to clean off as you go. You don't want to mess building up. This also helps make sure that when you're looking at the final piece, you're not distracted by all the crumblies that are on the bottom. So we're going to take the orchid gently out of the pot and get rid of as much of the medium that it came in. This is also going to require that you go in with a chopstick of some sort and get inside the roots and break up any of that material that's in there. I think a lot of these commercial orchids are started in a artificial material of some sort. I just noticed that whatever was inside that root ball was really tight. Could just be sphagnum moss, some orchid bark, but realistically, it was quite challenging to get in there. Be as careful as you can. You don't want to damage too many of the roots, and you can see a lot of these roots, even though they're a lot darker, they are still healthy roots. Some of them, a little bit up at the top, are dead, dried out completely. Those aren't going to come back. What's cool about Oncidium orchids is they're in the family of epiphytic species, so a lot of these roots will act as anchors as it grows inside the cloche. I'm positioning this plant. If you can see at the very base of it, there's a new growth coming out, and this is a rhizomal growth. As this plant grows, it sends out side shoots. And I wanted to see exactly where it was growing, so that's why I'm positioning that middle small new growth right in the middle of the wood. That's going to help orient the plant as it grows to not grow up against the glass of the cloche. Now I'm just going to gently backfill against the plant, making sure not to pack it in too tight. We want the orchid roots to breathe in this medium, and that's why we made it so the way we did. The perlite, the orchid bark, is going to really help make aeration possible, while the sphagnum moss is going to aid in humidity around the roots. Just using the chopstick to backfill in certain areas. We want it, like I said, snug but not terribly tight around the roots. As you water these plants, the soil is going to compact more. So again, you may really want to, I wouldn't say top fill it, but you are going to want to mound it up just a tiny bit. Here I'm using a paintbrush of any kind just to kind of clean off the wood where I'm going to be putting the moss. This isn't a necessary step, but I just want to make sure that everything's kind of clean and organized before I start putting moss on the wood portion. Before we add anything else, I want to give the plant a really good spray down. This is going to ensure that there's even moisture in the substrate, that the wood is primed and ready for moss addition, and the mulch that I'm going to be using, I'm calling it a mulch. It's a little experiment I'm working on just to see if any of the leaves of these ferns might transmit some spores into the soil and help produce some really cool little ferns inside the cloche as well. Like I said, it's an experiment. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to work or not, but I wanted to make sure that the soil was also moistened just to prepare the mulch and potential spores to activate. Now I'm just going to be placing some of the moss that I found in the greenhouse on the wood directly. This moss was found on some wood panels, so I just want to put it back onto a wood surface. If I found it on the soil, then I would probably put it on the soil, and I am going to be putting some on the soil just to see if it grows. You may also notice that the bowl that I'm using has some ridges on it. Those ridges were originally designed to hold some soil substrate in a clay mix to adhere moss to the side. I'm going to maybe do that later. I'm not entirely sure. I think it'd be really cool to see the whole container covered in moss and it looks like the plant is just floating in a moss ball. How cool would that look? But right now, I'm just going to see if I can keep the moss alive on the top. It is a little finicky. It's in a different environment, but I do hope that the closed cloche is going to help a lot. Anyway, let's see what the final product looks like. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Sorry the plant's a little bit worse for wear. I filmed it a little bit later than I should have. Thanks again for joining me. If you did like the video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and ring the notification bell. Have a good one.